ASIC ordered the manipulation of Australian democracy. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello again, John.
Hi, Martin. How are you today?
I'm very good. Lots of very important things to talk about today because, democracy is under threat.
Precisely. Martin, today is a very critical show because we've heard this term in the last couple of years, particularly in the context of Trump and the United States, called the deep state. The deep state is actually very real. It's very real in this country, and we're going to actually expose how this deep state actually works and what are the consequences in terms of this so-called deep state. And so just so we can set the context, Martin, is what is the deep state? The deep state is basically a whole bunch of highly paid bureaucrats who attempt to subvert the political system to push public policy in a direction that they want, which is against what the people want, but also in some instances what the people's representatives want. And so in the context of this ASIC inquiry, there's a very big story which has been brewing for 9 months. And that is what happened on the morning of the 27th of October, 2022. So for those who are relatively new to this channel and in terms of our storyline, so that day is the day that the Senate voted 43-20 to establish the inquiry into ASIC. Now, Senator Bragg has been pursuing ASIC because he had some information that ASIC attempted to manipulate the parliament to either block the inquiry or change the nature of the inquiry. And so he basically said to ASIC, hand over your communications. You're communicating with people in the Senate. We want to know who you spoke to and what you said. And so for 9 months, there's been a back and forth. We're not going to tell you what we said. This is all private. We don't have to tell you. And obviously Senator Bragg hasn't been willing to accept that. And so in the last week, Martin, through the latest series of documents I've obtained from ASIC through the Freedom of Information process, I was able to obtain a bombshell email from that particular morning. So we actually now have the definitive proof of what actually happened inside ASIC in the hours before the Parliament met to vote for the establishment of the inquiry. And that's what we're going to reveal today as to the order was given to manipulate democracy in the Senate. And we're going to explain what that order was and the implications of that.
Yeah, and this is very, very, very important because it's the critical point to understand is that the deep state is completely undemocratic. It's got its own agenda, and it's pushing things in a particular direction that wouldn't actually necessarily be in the interest of the people.
Absolutely. So the one thing I just want to, make sure the audience is crystal clear in terms of understanding when we talk about in terms of the deep state, particularly in terms of Australia. One of the things that people are pushing very heavily is what they call ESG, which is environment, social governance. It's a new framework of what corporations should be doing. And so a lot of the extreme things that are happening, particularly in the United States, whether it's around extreme positions around climate change or the transgender issue, plus a whole host of other social justice campaigns, it's all being driven by ESG. And a lot of companies are doing things that their customers don't want, and it's actually destroying shareholder value because they're actually being put under pressure by particular non-for-profit groups in America about these ESG scores. Now, who's been pushing ESG? The World Economic Forum. So Klaus Schwab and a whole bunch of global elites are pushing this framework all around the world, basically saying to corporates, particularly in the Western world, we want you to radically change Western society in order for them to achieve a vision which they think is better. Now, I don't think that the future is going to be better, but they're using this framework as the mechanism to push it. And who in the last 2 months gave a speech advocating for ESG and actually saying that this is the inevitable change? the chairman of ASIC. And so we can see that on the 13th of June, Joseph Longo gave a speech saying, ESG, major change is underway and we need to be ready. So rather than actually questioning whether ESG is the right thing for Australia, whether we should actually reject it if it's wrong, what are the long-term implications of ESG? ASIC is saying it's coming, it's inevitable, we just have to accept it. And he gave a speech along those lines, which is basically what the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab wants to do. Now, Martin, one thing that you and I discussed off camera, and I think it's important that we dwell on this point now, is that ASIC's priorities, in essence, they are Australia's financial police force. They are there to stamp out financial misconduct, particularly when it comes to fraud, theft, financial malfeasance. And so ASIC is doing a poor performance on its core duties, and yet it's now allocating resources and attention span on what I would say non-core issues, including ESG and things coming out of the World Economic Forum. And it is leading to a further decline in ASIC achieving the four objectives that both Parliament and the Australian people want.
Yeah, and just to be clear, ASIC's prime responsibility is to ensure that the financial system is working appropriately, that companies are doing what they should be doing, that investors are protected, etc., etc. And the fact that they are spending so much time on the ESG agenda must mean some dilution of focus on the critical issues that they should be focusing on. I'm not saying ESG isn't important, but in the scheme of things, the very basic capabilities that ASIC needs and the very basic role that it has is about the effective carriage of financial markets and the protection of investors. And we think they're failing in that.
Precisely. Now, look, so you and I agree that they're not focused on the core issue and they're failing in terms of what Parliament and what Australian people want. Now, Martin, if we go on to slide 2, I just want to highlight this because this comes from the last year's annual report. The chairman of ASIC, who is pushing the agenda of Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, how much is he getting paid per year? $823,000. And I'm seeing sum of money from someone who's leading an agency of 2,000 people. And rather than actually investigating well thought out fraud allegations like I've done, they're actually focused on how do we radically change Australian society to push a whole host of agendas that people at the World Economic Forum wants to see in Australia. And so when you have overly paid bureaucrats who are super arrogant, who are engaging in the manipulation of democracy, which we're about to expose, and they're not actually fulfilling their core duties, we have a completely corrupted public service and a public service that is clearly not acting in the interest of the people.
Absolutely. It is not fit for purpose, and it's not doing the very things that they should be doing. And the trouble is the track record is getting worse, not better, despite all of the protestations from ASIC itself.
Yes. Now, Martin, just so we can understand where ASIC fits in the political system, and because once we actually understand what their role is and where they fit, so what happened on the 27th of October will fit more into context. So there's an important constitutional principle that our audience needs to understand, which is called the separation of powers. So if we go on to slide 3, Martin, so this following quote comes from the New South Wales Parliament, and it says, quote, "In a democracy, the doctrine of the separation of powers exists to ensure that the people chosen to make laws are not the same people who are charged with executing them. In Australia, the separation of powers is combined with another doctrine called responsible government, by which members of the government are also members of Parliament and are accountable to the Parliament." So basically, in essence, Martin, is we have 3 branches of government. We have the legislature that makes the laws. We have the executive government, the cabinet, who is responsible for executing those laws and actually implementing the policies and the laws and the priorities that the Parliament sets. And then you have the courts that basically adjudicate where there are disputes between various entities, whether they be corporations, individuals, but also if those disputes are in terms of if they have disputes with law enforcement or in terms of the government. Martin, so if we think about what in terms of what is ASIC's role when we think about the separation of powers, so if we go on to the next slide, so basically we have a Parliament's role. If we look on the left hand side of the slide, Parliament's role is to enact the laws, it's to appropriate the money, it's basically to spend the money that they raise through taxes, and the taxes are set by the Parliament, and then Parliament's role as the legislature is there to oversee and hold accountable the executive government. Who is the executive government? I mean, that is effectively the cabinet. So the cabinet is basically the political entity that is there to execute and to enforce the laws and the priorities that the parliament sets. And then in this context, ASIC is part of the executive. So what does ASIC does? So Section 1 of the ASIC Act basically says it's got 3 core functions: enforce the law, maintain, facilitate, and improve the performance of the financial system, and to promote the confident and informed participation of investors and consumers. So ASIC has 3 basic roles: enforce the law, make sure the financial system works, make sure that consumers and investors are confident to participate in the economy and in the financial system to help grow the economy. That's all that ASIC has to do. So when we think about ESG, when we think about radical social change or environmental change, that is not ASIC's core duty or core function. And yet, as we showed earlier, that's exactly what they're focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, what are they focusing on versus what should they be focusing on? And we've been arguing all the way along that their area of focus is insufficient to reach the mandate that they actually have been given by Parliament.
Yes.
All right, John. So let's progress the conversation then to the specifics of the events that happened around the initiation of the Senate inquiry.
Yes. Now, Martin, in November, we did a particular provocative show about we're talking about deep state corruption. And in that show, we talked about question that Senator Bragg put on notice. And so if we put up slide 5, Martin, so in November of last year, Senator Bragg asked the question on notice to ASIC, quote, did ASIC undertake any engagement with members of Parliament in relation to this inquiry before it was considered by the Senate? So the answer is yes. ASIC engages with members of Parliament on a regular basis on a range of matters. So did ASIC talk to someone in the Senate on the day? The answer is yes. Now the critical thing here, Martin, is just like we said in the last slide, is we have this issue of the separation of powers. You have effectively ASIC, which is effectively the financial police force, and then you have Parliament's role is to oversee the police and make sure that they're actually enforcing the law and actually spending public money in an appropriate way. And so you cannot have a situation where you have the cops trying to rig the political process to interfere in the establishment of, in terms of an inquiry. So when somehow Senator Bragg caught wind of this, he became quite concerned about ASIC acting inappropriately. That's why he asked the question on notice. So we actually have a confession from ASIC. Yes, there was communication about the inquiry before the vote, but what type of communication? ASIC has been unwilling to reveal who at ASIC engaged or who at ASIC commenced that communication, who were they talking to, what was said. And so this has been an ongoing saga. And if anyone goes onto the inquiry webpage, you'll be able to see in the additional documents tab a whole host of letters back and forth over 9 months about the legal basis in which ASIC should hand over these communications or not. And so as of today, ASIC still refuses to even acknowledge who at ASIC started communicating with the senators, which senators did they speak to, what was said. And the only thing what we can say, Martin, is we know the outcome. The outcome is that Senator Bragg's motion was passed by the Senate 43-20, Labor voting against the motion. And Senator Bragg's motion it wasn't changed. So whatever attempt there was to influence the motion, it failed. Now, Martin, if we go on to the next slide, in this back and forth communication that's happened between the inquiry and ASIC, we have a letter that was signed by the General Counsel of ASIC, Chris Savundra, and this was on the 24th of April of this year. And because this communication has gone back and forth, ASIC has now offered in an official letter to Parliament an explanation as to what was ASIC trying to obtain in these communications that happened on the 27th of October. And this is what the General Counsel, which is effectively ASIC's internal lawyer, has told Parliament, quote, in respect of question 1 and set 4, the nature of the communications was to update ASIC on the progress of Senator Bragg's motion to establish the inquiry. ASIC sought to understand and confirm the scope and duration of the inquiry. Now, Martin, before I tell the audience what I think that means, what do you think that means?
So, John, it seems to me that what they're doing there is just trying to gain understanding of what actually happened. So they're not trying to influence, but just get information.
Yes, that's precisely how I read it. Is ASIC's official explanation to the Parliament is they just wanted information before the vote as to what's about to happen, how long is this inquiry going to go for, what does Senator Bragg want to look at, and the question one has to ask, Martin, is why did ASIC feel the need to communicate directly with senators about these issues? There's an appropriate channel in which ASIC can obtain this information because it's part of the executive branch of the government. It can go to their lead department, which is the Commonwealth Treasury, and ask the Treasury to potentially obtain this information from the minister, or ASIC could go to the minister themselves. So, and who's the minister? It's the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, or the Minister for Financial Services, Stephen Jones. So the only appropriate communication about obtaining more information about what Parliament's up to, it's either tuning in live, so you can actually understand what's going on, because Parliament's a public forum and anyone can listen into what Parliament's up to. Or if you want non-public information and you're in the executive branch of the government, you go through the minister. And there's no real need to actually communicate with anyone outside of the ministry. But we do know that on that day, ASIC did speak to various senators about various things. And according to ASIC, this was purely to obtain information and nothing more and nothing else. Now, if we go on to the next slide, now, Martin, here we get into the critical thing. So on the morning of the 27th of October, there's an email within ASIC from now I don't know who the person is, I just know the title, Senior Manager, Government Relations and External Affairs. They send the wording of the Bragg motion to the chairman of ASIC, Joseph Longo, and the first email is, quote, "Hi, Joe, please find current terms of reference," which is TOR, proposed in the Senator Bragg motion. And this is the critical quote, Martin. This is coming from the chairman on the morning of the vote. Quote, "This is extraordinary. What can be done to narrow the breadth of the terms? Can PJC do this?" Now, this is significant for two reasons, Martin. So let's take the second part is, so Senator Bragg is the chairman of the Senate Economics References Committee. The coalition has the majority number of senators on that committee. Senator Bragg would be leading the inquiry, which he has been for the last 9 months. And Joseph Longo was saying, can we give it to a different committee, PJC? So, and why would ASIC want PJC to lead such inquiry? Because it's controlled by the Albanese government. It's controlled by Labor. And so what we have in this second part of this sentence, Martin, is ASIC saying, we don't want Senator Bragg to do this. We don't want the coalition to lead this. We want to give it to Labor. We don't know why they wanted to give it to Labor, but that's the clear intention. Can PJC do this? I.e., can Labor run this inquiry rather than the coalition? So this is purely a political position, purely a political question that Joseph Longo is asking. But then if we go to the first part is, what can be done to narrow the breadth of the terms? I.e., we don't want Parliament to look at all these things. What can we do as ASIC to narrow what Parliament can look at? Now, if we think back to what we were just discussing before in this show, Martin, is about the separation of powers, Parliament's role is to pass laws and to oversee the performance of ASIC. Basically, they're setting an exam, like in terms of an inquiry. We're going to test you to see how well you've been performing because we give you all this money. We pass all these laws, and we expect you to enforce the laws that we pass. And you cannot have a situation, Martin, where you have an agency in the executive trying to manipulate or influence the what Parliament is looking at. It's completely unconstitutional, completely improper. I would say it is an abuse of power. And yet you see in this email that was sent on the morning, the chairman is saying, I don't want Parliament to look at certain things. I don't want Senator Bragg to lead this inquiry. I want Parliament to look at less things, and I want to give it to Labor. Completely inappropriate that he would ask this. Now, if we go on to the next slide, we can see in terms of what the next response is. So when he asked this question, can we narrow the terms? Can we give it to PJC? The response from the senior manager for government relations and external affairs says, "Hi, Joe. Yes, it is possible for it to be amended to be referred to PJC. Terms of reference can also be technically amended." I.e., Martin, the chairman of ASIC on $823,000, who is doing the bidding of the World Economic Forum, says, can we rig Parliament? The answer from the senior manager for government relations at ASIC says, yes, we can rig Parliament. Now, by what means? How? We don't know. Obviously, there was an attempt to talk to certain senators by ASIC, and that's what Senator Bragg is trying to uncover. But the key revelation of the show, Martin, is that ASIC, in an official letter to Parliament, says we just wanted information. We don't rig Parliament. We don't do anything like that. We just wanted to understand more about what was going on. And the emails I was able to obtain in the last week clearly shows that was a lie. There was an orchestrated plot to manipulate and rig Parliament, which was instigated and directed by the chairman of ASIC. His own henchmen in the government relations team said, we can do this. And they went off and did certain things. And whatever they did failed because the motion passed, and the motion, it was not amended in terms of the Senate. Now, the question now becomes is, well, when the order was given and the order was received and accepted by the senior manager, what happened after that? Now, in the last 48 hours, Martin, I've gone back to ASIC with a new Freedom of Information request, focusing on 2 ASIC employees who have the role of government relations in the Melbourne office. And I've asked for all of their records for 3 days in October around the establishment of the inquiry. And the clock's now ticking, and we have to wait another 30 days to see what records can we obtain to find out what exactly did they do, who did they email, did they text people, did they make a phone call? We'll have to see what those records are. But there should be no doubt that ASIC attempted on the 27th of October to manipulate the Parliament, to manipulate Australian democracy, to stop the will of the people being heard by the Australian Senate. And the question is, why? It's because ASIC is failing at their core responsibilities. They don't want to admit that. And rather than actually focusing on the bread and butter, they're pursuing policy objectives set by Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum, by policy objectives and frameworks like things like that in terms of ESG. And that is the big scandal that we're revealing in this show. And this whole situation is going to have some very real implications over the next 3 weeks. Now, if we go on to the next slide, what we can see is that this issue of manipulation of Parliament was raised in the interim report for the inquiry, and paragraph 1.31 said, quote, the question of whether ASIC sought to interfere in the Senate's works by influencing the terms of reference of the inquiry would be a matter better considered by the Senate Standing Committee of Privileges. It would be open to any senator to consider making such a referral. And then on the same day the interim report was released, Senator Bragg issued a press release saying, quote, The report also sets out concerns on ASIC's interference in the parliamentary process. A referral to the Privileges Committee will be made on this matter. So Joseph Longo is going to be investigated by the Senate for an abuse of power, contempt of the Parliament, seeking to actively interfere in democracy. Before the last week, I think Senator Bragg had a suspicion, but now that we actually have the smoking gun email, we have the email which clearly shows the chairman of ASIC giving the order and the order being received by the senior manager for government relations. This is going to be an absolute lock that he'll be referred for investigation. And this is a very now serious situation for in terms of ASIC, because they attempted to rig Parliament, subvert democracy. They then lied about it. They've now been exposed. They're going to be investigated by the Australian Senate, and the Senate has some extraordinary powers of what they can do to the ASIC chairman if he is found guilty. And we won't talk about those implications in this show because there's a famous story of something that happened in the 1950s with Parliament's powers that I want to cover in a future show. But people should have no doubt that over the next 3 weeks, this issue of rigging Parliament is going to be a big deal. We've got the smoking gun email after I was able to dig through a Freedom of Information request. I've sent off this email to Senator Bragg. He and his team have it. And Joseph Longo has some massive explaining to do because he can't hide. He tried to hide a few weeks ago when the when the first public hearing happened, when they were asked about Dorothy Dix's and do they plan questions in Parliament? And they said, well, we don't do this. It's not our normal practice. Well, we now have clear guidance that it is in the thinking of ASIC that they will attempt to influence or manipulate the political system in order to affect their policy agenda, which is not the policy agenda of the Parliament or the policy agenda of the Australian people.
Yeah, John, and there's a thing going through my head at the moment because there was this vote in the Senate, right? And of course, we got the 2 Senate inquiries. But you just wonder who was voting for what and why, and to what extent was ASIC influencing that behind the scenes, because we don't know precisely the conversations that took place or didn't take place, or the messages that took place around the vote. So this is a very live and critical issue, isn't it?
Yes, and I'm glad you raised that, Martin. During this parliamentary vote, which senator stood up and actually well, we don't know if they acted on the orders of ASIC, but they did exactly what ASIC wanted them to do, because they basically argued against the Bragg inquiry and the Bragg terms of reference and said, let's do it at the PJC exactly with what Joseph Longo says.
Yeah, very interesting. With the hindsight we now have from your FOI, there's stuff going on, isn't there?
Who stood up to fulfill the orders of ASIC? It was Senator Deb ONeill, and I think she has some questions to answer as to, did she stand up in the Senate and advocate what she believed in, or was she under orders from either ASIC or from her own or from the Albanese government to oppose the Bragg motion and the inquiry that we have happening? Because here's the important thing that most people will not know, Martin, is, if we put up the last slide for people to see, is that so you can see that on the morning of the 27th, Deb ONeill stood up and said, there's no need for the Bragg inquiry because I've just set up a different inquiry of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Corporations Financial Services. Now, at that inquiry, Martin, there was no, since over the last 9 months, that inquiry has done absolutely nothing. So the Bragg inquiry has gone and conducted a proper inquiry into all these issues that need to be looked at, and the Labor inquiry has done nothing. Now, 2 weeks before that vote, Senator ONeill wrote me a letter basically saying, quote, I note your calls for a committee investigation into ASIC. The committee already conducts regular scrutiny of ASIC through our quarterly oversight hearings, and I believe an additional inquiry would be a duplication of committee processes. So, Martin, on the 13th of October last year, Senator O'Neill said to me she doesn't agree with having an inquiry because she didn't think there was any need given what the inquiry already does. But those processes that this Parliamentary Joint Committee actually does, it doesn't actually give members of the public to get their teeth into the ability to tell their real stories about their experience with ASIC, and that's why the standalone inquiry was important. So 13th of October, Senator O'Neill writes to me and says, no need for inquiry. On the morning of the vote, when ASIC says, we want you to rig it, she stands up and opposes the Bragg motion, and then she says, allow me to run the inquiry because I've just set one up. And what we have seen over the last 9 months is nothing has happened on her with her committee. It's run dead, and the Senator Bragg inquiry continues to go forward. And now we have a situation where in the next few weeks, Joseph Longo is going to be referred for investigation for the not just the attempt, but the act of conspiracy to subvert the will of the Australian people and Australian democracy. And I think this is very serious because we cannot have a situation where unelected bureaucrats who are being paid obscene sums of money, who are doing the bidding of the World Economic Forum, are allowed to run Australia in a particular direction that we don't want Australia to run. At the end of the day, it's our country, Martin. It's the people's country, and the people should have the ultimate say through our elected representatives as to the country we want. And we don't need these elite bureaucrats to tell us what the future is going to look like. The future should be what we want it to be, not what Joseph Longo wants it to be.
Yeah, and that's democracy at work, John, isn't it? Because democracy means it is the interests of the people and the voice of the people that determines what happens, rather than a set of doctrines being distilled top down from international entities or wherever. And it comes right back to protecting the interests of the people.
Yes. I mean, one final point perhaps that you could reflect on, Martin, now that you're back in the United Kingdom. I mean, when the will of Parliament was interfered by King Charles I in terms of the 17th century, what did the parliamentarians do? They took up arms and they fought the king and beheaded the king. So Parliament was able to prevail. So the importance of Parliament's independence to basically set its own agenda, to be able to speak in terms of its own mind and not to be manipulated either by the king or the king's government. I mean, this is talking about 500 years of English history, which has now come through Australia into 2023. So these are long-standing principles that people shed blood in your country now, and we if we're going to continue to have a functioning parliamentary system that we've inherited from the United Kingdom, these principles that people died for over where you are now, Martin, they have to be preserved.
Absolutely. Very critical that they are, because otherwise the whole notion of democracy gets chucked out. And that is not a good outcome for anybody, I suppose, unless you're the elites. But unfortunately, the truth is that the elites have more and more power, more and more ability to influence directly and indirectly. And that means that ordinary people, ordinary businesses are, shuttled into the sideline. It's not good. It's not appropriate. It's not appropriate at all. So we'll keep reporting on this, John, and the next 2 or 3 weeks look as though they'll be really interesting.
Absolutely.
Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.